This is the Art of Darkness podcast with Kevin Kautzman
and Brad Kelly. We're a couple of very online writers interested in the dark side of what drives creative people to create against all odds.
This show is about art and the people who make it, what it costs them, and what it takes to bring something unique and impactful into the world.
Each episode, we excavate the life and work of an artist you might think you know.
Don't worry, they're all safely dead.
On every episode, we try and find out just what the hell was wrong with them and how they worked through their darkness to create something that lives on after them and continues to move culture.
Find us online at artofdarkpod.com and on Twitter at artofdarkpod. All right, we've got some sponsors for the pod now.
Wait, what?
Every link you need for the things we talk about here is at artofdarkpod.com/sponsors. First up, books.
If you're into this podcast, odds are you're probably a reader. We've got links to buy new books from bookshop.org and used books from alibris.com.
And if you want to listen to your books, we recommend and use audible.com.
It's great, and the catalog is huge.
All right. So if you're listening to this, you are online.
Maybe you're very online.
You probably have a website or are thinking of starting one. Maybe you want a website like artofdarkpod.com. We built that with WordPress, which is by far the most popular way to create websites. And the single best host for serious WordPress is WP Engine. I've personally used them for over a decade now, and I don't host my websites anywhere else. Go to artofdarkpod.com/sponsors and click on the WP Engine link to learn more.
Finally, the best way to support the show is at patreon.com/artofdarkpod. Get the bonus After Dark content for every episode, access to the book club, and more.
Thanks for supporting Art of Darkness. And I don't think that was too painful. I think we did a pretty good job there.
Yeah, that sounded good.
Yeah, we appreciate it.
All right, and we are back with another Dark Room episode. I'm Kevin Kautzman. I am Kevin Kautzman. I'm not Kevin Kautzman.
We're keeping it.
Wow.
I'm not. Are you? No, you know what I've been doing? I
know.
distracted Brad because I'm boxing. I'm boxing over here. I'm boxing him. I distracted him. Yo, listen. No, yesterday was Hug a Kevin Day. And so, Brad, this is stolen valor. That is Brad Kelly. Brad Kelly.
There's no Hug a Brad Day.
There's no Hug a Brad Day.
No.
I am Kevin Kautzman,
Yes.
and this is the Art of Darkness, and this is a dark room, and we are going to be talking Hemingway
Yes.
with our friend Dylan. Dylan, how are you?
Yes, and Dylan, just for so in case people don't know, Dylan is writing one of the premier Substack. So there's a lot of interesting things going on Substack right now. Yeah, you are. Believe the hype, people. We'll have links to all of this, but essayful.substack.com. And you can follow Dylan at Essayful. That's Essayful. Dylan, thank you for joining us. We appreciate your time, and we're really looking forward to this conversation.
No, it's a pleasure. Long-time listener, first-time Zoomer.
All right, great. Well, we'll kind of tell us, I guess, before we get into specifically Hemingway stuff, just tell us a little bit about your Substack, about sort of what your goals are, the kind of stuff you're posting there, and if there's other projects, that's kind of the only thing I'm familiar with. But if you've got other stuff going on that you want to tell people about too, that's also great.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So it all began about 10 years ago. So I'm 27 now. So I went off and did English in Trinity College Dublin, and then and then you need to get a degree because that just opened so many doors. And I said,
that's a good school.
It is a good school. Yeah.
It's a great building. Once you get inside it and you get into the bureaucratic nitty gritty, it falls quickly in your estimation. But it has the Book of Kells. It has some cool stuff.
Yeah.
So very quickly stopped going and just started, hanging out in the library, using the resources and kind of developing my own kind of curriculum. And then, it's funny. It was like there's no exams, so it was all written essays, basically, pretty much at the end of the year. So you'd have 12-week modules. So I'd arrive in week one, bushy-tailed, and then I'd pick out which week I would actually end up doing my essay on. So I would attend that 1 week out of the 12 and then hand something in at the end and kind of just do my own thing in the
Nice.
meantime.
Nice.
Yeah. So again, how universities are these days. So I got to taste that firsthand. So that was about 9, 10 years ago now. So then I've been kind of reading and keeping notes for a long time, and then this Essayful thing is like finally public facing something. So it's just been sitting kind of dormant in my computer, precariously sometimes, almost lost it all a couple of times. But
Oh
now so I'm
no.
starting to kind of try and make that kind of reader friendly. Yes, that's what I'm going for.
Okay, very cool. Very cool. And one of the things that you most recent things on there actually is a sort of 3-part series on Hemingway and the craft of writing. And one of the things that I liked about this is, I'm a writer, Kevin's a writer, and a lot of the social media communities that we're in or adjacent to are writers. And there's a lot of advice out there that's very, I suppose it's useful, but there's a lot of I'm trying to seek for a charitable adjective.
Horse shit.
Yeah, okay, fair enough.
Hustle bro type. It could be copy pasted into any domain. Yeah.
Yes. It's sort of like, did you try working hard? Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's kind of like,
Jocko
obviously.
Willing for writers. Yeah.
Right. And
Mm.
you've got a much different tact, and I especially in this Hemingway piece, which I really respect. You've kind of gone to Hemingway and pulled out the deep wisdom that you can from his life and his work. And I guess the question here is, for writers, what is there to learn from Hemingway? I know that's a big question.
Jesus. uh, so yeah, there's I think there's so much. I think the culture now and the literary community writ large is like gasping for a Hemingway type figure, and he kind of took flight in very similar times in around World War One, when the style was very highfalutin, very verbose. Language was like hyperinflating at a remarkable rate due to propaganda and all that stuff from World War One. So he was kind of like a writer who was like very very wary, and kind of like a colleague more than a friend of words themselves. So he was always kind of trying to do most with less, and kind of not let anything just live on surreptitiously. I don't even know how to pronounce that word. But
Nailed it.
yeah.
Nailed
So
it.
again, it's that kind of dogged narrowing down. Like you read a lot of fiction now. It's unfair to call it looks like a first draft, but like it's not built to last. It's kind of it's built for this week, this month.
Mm-hmm.
And he kind of constantly positioned himself in kind of a combative relationship with time and the classics. He didn't read a lot of contemporary stuff, which didn't pay a lot of public respect to contemporary stuff, which led to a lot of blowouts with his friends. So I think I was thinking the other day, like you look back, I don't know if you've seen that documentary of Gore Vidal and William F. Buckley.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And these kind of relationships, and I think he had a similar one with Norman Mailer, and even Faulkner and Hemingway had their type thing. It's like like writers aren't supposed to be friends, so they're supposed to be this kind of competitive streak, and they're not pampering, they're not worried about like, okay, if I say about this guy this time, maybe that scuppers a book deal that's coming down the line in 6 months. It's kind of there's always kind of social climbing and schmoozing,
Mm-hmm.
which leaves us as readers the worse off.
Absolutely.
So I want to bring back the literary fruit. We need more of that.
Yeah, I think we can blame the academy and the academic style and the American academic job market and the MFA system for a lot of this.
Yeah, because everybody everybody you meet you might need to ask them for a reference later, or you feel like you might need to anyway, right? That's the impression that you're given. But it's interesting. It's like there barely is even a publishing industry anymore. There barely even is so like really you're gonna sacrifice all of your personal integrity so that you can get your 10th of a disappearing pie. Like, what's the point even? In my opinion, Yeah.
Yeah, I interviewed Urban Walsh at the end of last year for the Spectator, and yeah, he did not have glowing things to say from MFA students. He said you can smell them out. As soon as you read it, you know where it came from. And he was he was giving up, because then he does some lectures and stuff like that, and like every single lecture is immediately like, and he puts on this American accent. He's like, "What's your process?" So it's like, he's
Right.
like the Americanization of the whole thing, and again, becoming its own.
Yeah, it's they want well-trained house pets. They want house pets. Yeah. You definitely have to sing. Yeah, you have to sing for your. Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And that is where art goes to die, for sure. Yeah. Interesting. How long have you been a Hemingway devotee? When did you come to him first, and what was your reading history? What did you read first? Do you recall?
I think I read A Farewell to Arms when I was in college, and I didn't like it because I had to read it. Mm-hmm. It was one of those 12 weeks where I actually had to sit down and do reading that was theirs as opposed to mine. I think there's something with Hemingway where I think it's the first time around a lot of people overshoot it or overlook it because it is simple, it is basic, so then they can be pejoratives if you kind of come in with the wrong frame of mind. But then it's upon the rereadings when you start to see, okay, this is like, it's not as if there's like 10% here and 90% missing. It's like there's 10% here, but there's 90% underneath.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you what I really got to love him was when I started to understand what he's doing. So this is like one of the rare occasions when reading the secondary literature and a little bit of criticism kind of improves your actual reading of the fiction. Because when you kind of get to know the man who's kind of an intoxicating kind of character in life, and again, so contrary to the literary archetype. I think there's an article recently, like, the death of the literary bro, that whole thing has gone out the window.
Right.
So it's kind of a breath of fresh air in that sense. So then it was like kind of reading his fiction and his nonfiction, and then there actually is some really cool criticism on him. Don't even like that word, but this is just some cool analyses of his craft and life so I kind of read them in tandem. So I'm learning about him and his books, and this kind of that rebounding effect between the two that I kind of fell in love with.
Yeah, that can be very rewarding. When I did the Dante episode, knowing more about his life obviously opened up so much about the comedy and all the rest. Obviously, many centuries apart here, but it can be really rewarding. Yeah, and Hemingway lived a wild life. He was a rock star. He couldn't go anywhere in Spain; he'd be mobbed.
Yeah.
And he got very famous in his hometown very young for his heroism in World War One. Brad, it looked like you had something.
Well, the next place I was going to go was this bit from your Substack piece on Hemingway about it's from an interview where he is asked. Hemingway is asked, who would you say are your literary forebears, those you have learned the most from? And I love this list. And just thinking about a writer now, giving a list similar to this, right? He says, Mark Twain, Flaubert, Stendhal, Bach, Turgenev, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Chekhov, Andrew Marvell, John Donne, Maupassant, the good Kipling, Thoreau, Captain Marryat, Shakespeare, Mozart, Quevedo, Dante, Virgil, Tintorito, Hieronymus Bosch, Bruegel, Tavernier, Goya, Giotto, Cezanne, Van Gogh, Gauguin, San Juan de la Cruz, and Gongora.
Art of Darkness season 4 coming 2024. It sounds like our that's brilliant.
Add numbers to that. You got your next few episodes lined
up. Seriously, right? And what's interesting about it to me is, and what I love about this list is it's not all writers. I think it might not even be half writers. I mean, Bosch, Bruegel, Mozart,
composers, painters. I think there's like an adventurer in there.
Yeah. And that's always. That's fascinating to me that he's not only aware of their influence, but he understands that he has taken something from these people as influences on his literary work. I mean, what can you say about you had your piece about him being a polymath. Talk about that a little bit. Hemingway, the polymath.
Yeah, so that was actually a failure of a piece in a way, because it was meant to, this 3-part series was meant to be 8. So then that whole polymath thing was meant to be stretched out, and I was going to do essays on, like, Hemingway the painter, Hemingway the architect, Hemingway the poet, because he just drew so heavily from these domains. The painting one for me, I think, is up there with the most interesting, and his love of Cézanne. Which, again, when you think of Hemingway, you don't think of, like, these kind of, like, a stylistic kind of, modernistic painters that would be an influence. He's kind of cast in a very different light today. But then when you kind of do read through his stuff, and again, he was infatuated with how Cézanne did so much with so little, and you get an entire landscape with, like, not even the requisite amount of brushstrokes,
right?
And then the readers filling in the rest, and then that kind of stemmed. I think that forged a lot of his rivalry with Faulkner as well, where it's like Faulkner was often talking about, like, the thunderous silence of prose. So he was a writer of the ear. Whereas Hemingway was a writer of the eye. It's all pictorial, it's all visual. There's no Tolstoyan consciousness seeping in. Like, it doesn't let that kind of psychology or that kind of psychoanalysis enter at all. So it's all just, scene after scene, moving straight through, which I think is the beauty and the detriment of some of his writing, because I think, in my eyes, the short stories are what he was. He was a short storyist, and then the fiction, the plot is not there.
Yeah,
which is because you need psychology. You need to, like, that kind of artifice implanted in it, which kind of ruins the realism, because life doesn't really work out as plots.
Yeah.
And again, like our time now, his time was like, grand narratives collapsing all around him. These are World War One on the front lines, and then World War Two. He kind of went back, but just, like, with his pen at this time.
Yeah.
So he's, like, totally disenchanted with all the artifice. Yeah.
I found an interesting article here in the background I'm going to read a bit from, and this is widewalls.ch, Hemingway's work and art influences, talking about his time in Paris in the 20s. Besides fraternizing with artists, Hemingway was also an avid visitor of museums and galleries, among which he preferred the Louvre, the MoMA, the Prado, the Accademia in Venice, and the Art Institute of Chicago. Lillian Ross, a New Yorker journalist, in a reportage on her meeting with Hemingway in 1950 when he was on his way from Havana through New York to Europe, noted that Hemingway wanted to pass through the city without much publicity, but he expressed his wish to visit some of the museums again, quoting, "I don't want to see anybody I don't like, nor have publicity, nor be tied up all the time. Want to go to the Bronx Zoo, Metropolitan Museum, Museum of Modern Art, ditto of Natural History, and see a fight. Want to see the good Bruegel at the Met, two fine Goyas, and Mr. El Greco's Toledo. I'm going to try to get into town and out without having to shoot my mouth off. Time is the least thing we have of." And this connection is very interesting. And I don't want to sort of overstate this, but they were devastated when Mary was devastated that she wasn't able to get back the paintings and things from the finca in Cuba when Castro and company seized the paintings. The impression I have is that I don't know if this is overstating it, but it seems possible to me that if Hemingway had never made a dime from his writing, the collection of paintings that he had from that period in Paris may have been enough to make them multimillionaires, or at least comfortable. I mean, he writes about it in A Movable Feast, about how they would go without clothes they just wouldn't buy new clothes, and instead they bought paintings.
Wow. Yeah.
So that's well put.
Why didn't they just right click save as? Like, what's the
Hemingway as the NFT bro?
NFT, I was just going to think, Jesus Christ, he'd have killed himself sooner.
Yeah,
right. Yeah.
But there's a I think he said, coming back to his infatuation with Cézanne, he says, like, and it kind of ties these two things together. He said, I learned, like, more writing from walking around the Louvre on an empty stomach, looking at Cézanne, than I kind of did from reading any of my peers, basically. But that empty stomach thing as well, and there's like accounts where, you kind of get this kind of flamboyant, again, you kind of rock star life, but he was like, he took the starving artist and the integrity of that, like, extremely seriously. There's like stories of him in Paris, kind of just living on potatoes, turning down huge deals coming in. I think it was the second time in Paris, huge deals coming in to write schlock for, the American publishers, but he wouldn't do it because his legacy was like his one kind of North Star that he was just not going to fuck with, basically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting how, we kind of earlier in the conversation we're talking about the sort of striver aspect and the trying to please everybody and trying to fit in and thinking that will be the route which will, as an artist, might allow you to establish the kind of reputation you might want or need. But some of the people who've had the most distinct personas as artists have been people who didn't make any effort to do that at all, right? And they sort of play up certain aspects of their personality. It's them, but it's also perhaps at times a slightly. And Hemingway was a fabulist in conversation. I mean, I don't think he was going to not tell a good. He never let a fact get in the way of a good story, I don't think. But my point is, it's like his development of a personal persona of his own myth making wasn't going around making friends with everybody necessarily so much as it was doubling down on Hemingway. And there's people like, and Cormac McCarthy was similar but different in that apparently like no real effort to develop a public persona, and in that vacuum one kind of creates itself that's interesting to people, right? Like you try to imagine McCarthy going to we have a conference here. What is it? The AWP. Cormac McCarthy going to AWP every year. Like that's not gonna happen. First, like it wouldn't have helped him either. So it's just interesting, I think, comparing some of these figures who still have large presences in that world and how they went about it and how different it is than I think the recommendations that people would give you, right? If somebody was like, here's how to have a writing career, it wouldn't be, nobody would tell you to do what Hemingway did. And yet that seemed to work better than anybody else's route.
Let me hedge a little bit and say he married well 2 times. He married well a couple of times, and he married money the second time. And that, frankly, is advice you'll see out there. Which
well, that's fair.
Is always extraordinarily embarrassing to me for some reason. When I read that, I just recoil in horror, probably because of my Midwestern upbringing. But that's real advice that people will give. Like, you want to be a writer? Make sure you marry well.
Right.
Okay. But yeah, I'm with you, Brad. I mean, nobody would say go and offend people, go and make enemies of your colleagues. Some people would even say, go and get an MFA. I always say, if you're going to get an MFA, make sure they pay you. Yeah. That's the caveat I have. But at the same time, other people will tell you don't bother and save the time and go and live.
I have, so Dylan, Kevin, and I are both MFA survivors, and so we both have mixed opinions about that. It's great in some ways, but I think like any educational program, there is a process of unlearning that has to happen later afterwards. Not that you unlearn everything, but that you go back through and you kind of pick and choose what was of value and where the gaps were, perhaps, and try to try to undo what any damage that might have.
Sure, a lot of the
done.
damage is in your own head, right? Because you sort of imagine it'll be one thing, but reality never works out that way.
Right.
I want to say too, on this podcast, we always do 4 Patreon After Dark episodes. We prep something a little extra.
Yeah.
I'm really enjoying the conversation so far. If you want to hear a little extra bit after the fact, patreon.com/Art of Dark Pod. Patreon updated their app. They had
It's slick now.
One of the worst apps in the world. It was horrific.
Yes.
And they did, it's a white pill. I mean, I'm so pleased. One of the things I say about Silicon Valley is that it's all bait and switch up and down the line. Yeah. And they corner the market and then everything degrades or gets more expensive or whatever. They seem to have actually done a positive thing here. So I'm very pleased with this. Patreon.com.
There's chat in there now. There's Patreon chat, which is huge
there now. So if you want maybe a less noisy version of the Telegram. We love the Telegram. We love our Telegram people, t.me/Art of Dark Pod. But there's a second chat. That's like maybe, I don't know, behind the curtain at patreon.com/Art of Dark Pod. We are going to talk about specifically on the After Dark, The Garden of Eden, which is the kind of gender-bendy novel that Hemingway wrote, which was released posthumously, if I'm not mistaken.
In the 80s, I think, right?
Yeah, and I'm going to read something from this. And I know we've talked about it before, like on our core episode, but I think it'll be interesting to have Dylan with us and talk a little bit about that. Maybe we can, I guess, take the conversation there for a minute and come back to it on the After Dark. Dylan, are you familiar with that novel?
I can't say I've read it. No, to be honest, I can't.
Yeah,
posthumous stuff. Couldn't do it to the man. You know, not let. Well, that's my excuse for just actually not reading it.
No, fair enough. Yeah, no,
he'd have been infuriated with the idea of posthumous releasing stuff that he didn't sign off on.
He'd be infuriated anyway. He was just, I think that's where he lived. But he
go from a 9 to a 10.
Yeah. I mean, Hemingway, to me, we just did. Oh my God, Brett, who did we just do yesterday? Mishima yesterday. And No Chill, we said. No. And I feel like Hemingway is like kind of an American version of that. Like where Hemingway was able to chill out was probably like heavily drunk. But then is that really chill?
Right.
I don't think it really qualifies. With The Garden of, if you're a Hemingway completist, of course you have to read The Garden of Eden, but it's definitely not like rush to read this.
But it's
Dylan,
what's so interesting about it to me is the sort of the left turn it forces you to make on your perception of him as a person, right? It's sort of like, oh, he wrote, as we'll talk about in the aftermath.
An entire novel that he had to kind of hide away because of the persona that he had cultivated,
right?
And it runs so contrary to the persona. Very interesting. Gender bendy, legitimately, you could say capital Q queer novel from Hemingway.
Unexpected.
Very unusual. Dylan, what do you think is his finest book? If you had to say your favorite,
my favorite, I would say. I do lean more nonfiction than fiction. Like I love it, but not like the kind of like a Steven Pinker kind of sterile. Not casting shade, but I mean just in the writing style. But like the kind of literary nonfiction. So I think Death in the Afternoon. For me, it's just so many quotes that you can just pull, and I think that's where he kind of was most at ease, I think, because his fiction is so journalistic. That's kind of where his style came from. That's how he actually kind of seemed to spend the voluntary portions of his life, literally getting back on the front lines. Received a Medal of Honor, I think, for his stuff from the Spanish Civil War. So I think he was in his pocket there, and I think the fiction was almost something that he kind of, it may have come from a more high-minded like a notion of himself. Because I think he only wrote. I think I'm going to get my timelines right. I think he only decided he wanted to write a novel after he was hanging out with Gatsby and he read.
With Fitzgerald.
Yeah, with Fitzgerald. Yeah,
with Fitzgerald, sorry,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
But then he read an early draft of Gatsby, and then he said it. And again, that's that's the competitive streak. It's kind of like, fuck you. Okay,
Yeah, he's got to beat that now, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So
Oh,
But dude, it would be
Can't-
Kevin, think about this. It's tough. You're a young writer, and you got a buddy who, yeah, you like him, and you're like, oh, let me read your thing, and he hands you The Great Gatsby, and you're like, Jesus Christ.
right.
damn,
Right.
it's fucking good. Yeah,
You're
yeah.
expecting some kind of half-assed sort of, I'm gonna have to pretend I like this. And, and he hands you one of the great novels of the 20th century.
Absolutely.
And you're a competitive guy like Hemingway, that would just, oh my God. Yeah.
Yeah, we should at some juncture do an episode, a special. Maybe we'll do it for Patreon, just about Hemingway and Fitzgerald.
Yeah, it's an interesting.
There's so much to unpack there. We have the book of letters and everything, and
The letter's incredible. Yeah.
You have, Hemingway, this sort of Chicago Protestant, but ultimately, I think, did he convert? I can't remember. In any case, he sort of flirted with Catholicism, but then he got Fitz, and Fitz went to Princeton, and just the whole dynamic is just. And then they're in Paris. I mean, what a time to be alive.
It's like a father-son relationship, even though they were the same age.
Right.
When you read the letters, he's kind of constantly telling us to man up and kind of get over it and stop
Yeah.
doubting yourself. That's incredible.
Yeah, well, Hemingway
Right.
was never going to put himself in the sort of any kind of like subaltern position, right? It was never going to be like, I mean, he was an apprentice. He was an apprentice to dead writers that he loved from the past, but another guy that he knows in person, he's not going to sort of bend the knee to that guy.
It's probably Revenge of the Great Gatsby. That kind of had that dynamic. He immediately probably took charge and kind of just started little broing him.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But didn't he introduce Fitzgerald to Max Perkins? I think that's right.
The
order of operations. It's the stuff of legend.
Those relationship triangles out there are just so mad. You see, it's like, oh, damn, I can't remember who it was. Just kind of avant-garde writer, and it's just he tells it just going into Ezra Pound's little studio, and then Hemingway was there teaching him how to box, and then there was like a scrap between him and one of them was on the floor, and it constantly Joyce was a bit of a bro as well. Like I think the glasses kind of don't do him justice in the pictures. He kind of looked a bit nerdy, but apparently he was a raging alcoholic as well through the
poem. Oh yeah.
Well, he was famously underbred per Virginia. Wolf, I'm preparing Beckett right now, Dylan, and I don't know. What are your, just indulge me for a moment. What's your take on Beckett in 30 seconds?
I like Beckett. I think he perhaps the opposite of Hemingway, in the sense that Hemingway it's real life and nothing else, and then with Beckett it's all nothing else and very little real life. It's kind of complete intellectualism and high-mindedness. But yeah, there's an interesting kind of link between those two as well, where that idea of the expat, and Joyce wrote about that. It's like, I couldn't write about Dublin until I left Dublin, and Beckett kind of had a lot of that as well. Shaw had a lot of that as well, and Hemingway had loads of that. You kind of said, like, I couldn't write about Michigan until I was in Paris. I couldn't write about Madrid until I left. So this kind of sense of distance and kind of getting out of the heat of the moment, and then coming back to it with kind of cold look to really kind of like nail down on the details of things. He talks about boiling down reality and never spreading it thin. And then tying in with Eliot's objective correlative as well. He says, like, he just wanted to get down the kind of mechanism that would make the reader have the experience. He says, like, in the first draft you get all the kick and the reader gets none, and by the end you should get zero kick, so the reader gets it all. It's kind of like stripping himself out of it and just not letting his kind of ego or emotions get in the way.
I like that. That's certainly been true in my experience. It's the later drafts it's not that much fun anymore. You keep doing it and it's rewarding in its own way, but it doesn't match the adventure that the first draft is. what are some other Hemingway, and I don't want to do this like top 10 Hemingway tricks for writing, but like
Here's how to, yeah.
what are some other things you've learned in your relationship with Hemingway that are beneficial to writing that you have young writer out there might want to hear?
Yeah, there's a lot. I think this idea again. This is kind of why I kind of honed in on that word craft in the
Mhm.
first place. I think William Dershowitz, not the lawyer,
Mhm.
he wrote something really cool as well about how this kind of transition from craft to write from craft to art.
Mhm.
And this is where there's all kind of notions about like, writer's block and having to get inspired and all that stuff kind of came. And that wasn't the case back then. And you look at words like playwright, and that right at the end is like it's like a maker. So it's like they just saw themselves as just putting things together. Like and there wasn't this kind of, again, it was kind of more of a mechanical craftsman like task. It didn't have all this kind of like, intellectual social status baggage attached to it. So he took that really seriously, and he was like, like he has a quote of like, I'm apprenticed out until I die. Like, only dopes say they mastered it. Um, and again, that ties back with how much he venerated the past as well. So I think that that's a huge thing. And again, uh, also again, kind of, is slightly out of kilter with our times. It's that he was said like, it never gets easy, and then
Mhm.
it never even gets easier. So he said like, don't be a bitch, basically. I think what it
Yeah.
might even be a direct quote, and it said like, forget your personal tragedy. It's not meant to be easy. It doesn't get easier, and I feel impotent every time I sit down to write. And he said like
Mhm.
the only reason that people pay writers in the first place, like a writer is just a measure of your ability just to stay at the desk. Like, so you kind of say everyone comes in the same. It's just the last one to get up loses, and then there's the last one still sitting down.
Yeah.
That's where kind of immortality lies.
Yeah.
Um, so
Oof.
I think,
I
everything's
agree
so
with
easy
that.
now, and it's like, you fucking Uber Eats and shit. You don't even you get into
Right.
supermarkets, and then so that kind of chasm between, like the difficulty of everyday life and the difficulty that writing is supposed to have. Good writing is supposed to have.
Mhm.
So I think that's kind of like slightly the easiness of it is kind of pulled writing away from how hard people are able to stay in the boiling pot type thing.
Yeah. No, I quite like that. I there's that's something that I feel like this is not about my writing process, but just relating to this person. That's something that I felt like I've tried to think about is like, um, if you just work really hard, you don't even need to be talented, right? Like you can just, if you just
No,
keep going, you don't even actually need to be like innately good at the thing. And I think innate talent is not necessarily overrated, but it's one piece of a complicated set of things that lead to somebody writing a book like For Whom the Bell Tolls, right? Clearly Hemingway has talent, but there's plenty of talented people that don't ever really do anything with it.
yeah. I think maybe the one I think talent is the myth of being born with talent. I think, life can take so many left and right turns all the way
Mm.
through that doesn't really add up to me. I think, unfortunately, for those I disagree with, I think taste, maybe having that eye to be able to discern the good from the bad. I think anyone kind of moves through things, but to be able to make those decisions early and kind of just have that snapshot, instinctual good bad moving forward. I think that maybe I just know some people that can, they don't even know they don't have it type thing, and I was like, okay, maybe that's like a thing, and it is literally it's an it. It's
Yeah.
like, it's like a charisma thing people have in social settings. I think there's an artistic version of that where people just
Yeah.
have an eye and a way of maneuvering around things. So that may be
Yeah, I
uh,
literally like that. There's something from I remember a little. There's an interview with Ira Glass. People who've listened to This American Life will know Ira Glass, and he said something about generally when people get into an art, they do the reason that they start is because they actually have very good taste. Like they're able to see something and understand what's good about it, what they don't, and then the problem is when you start trying to make your own thing, if you have good taste and then you just start, there's no way what you do is going to match your good taste. And what happens is most people go, well, the thing I made sucks. And obviously, I'm never going to live up to that thing. right? Like, and it's the process of like bringing your ability up to your taste that can take years, right? And many, 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 many failures.
Well, and this is where culture and maybe an MFA program, maybe just moving in a circle of writers can help, because what they aren't going to teach you in a typical education is that the Great Gatsby that is sitting on the shelf right now over here at Barnes and Noble or whatever is the finished gem of how many drafts? 20? I don't know. I don't know how many drafts he did. And the work of one of the greatest editors of all time that you can't see, you don't see the process. You just, and that's all you're going to read throughout your education is going to be the masterpieces of the greatest writers working with the greatest editors who've ever lived. And that's where your taste is developed for young writers. And I don't mean age, for anybody who's starting to write, you need to understand that first draft is not the finished thing.
Yeah. And I think Hemingway even famously said the first draft of anything is shit.
Yeah. Without a doubt.
Yeah.
We need to impress that upon people. And if you're teaching writing and all the rest, if I was teaching it to people, I would be saying, you just have to know that final product that you've looked at your entire life, you're just seeing all you're consuming are masterpieces, right? So one good trick is to kind of really go deep and be a completist with an author who you admire. I remember I did that with Steinbeck. When I came back, I'd been living over in London for a year, and I came back and I really immersed myself in all the Americans. I read Hemingway, I read Fitzgerald, I read Steinbeck, I read Faulkner. I said, why haven't I consumed all of this stuff? I'm going to go do it now. And when I got to Steinbeck, I really went and read his Juvenilia. And I was like, oh, this is garbage. Like, oh, you can do that. And then, and that's how you arrive somewhere. Killing you with me?
There's an interesting dynamic. I think I heard it said recently that, well, first of all, it's like the worst tragedy ever to befall a writer is when you get your first novel published. So you kind of want to have a huge scrap heap of stuff. And then they say that, these kind of breakout stars, it's often, like one hits the shelves and there's 9 in the cabinet. And then the problem is you get that success, and then all of a sudden, now for the first time in your life, you have a deadline and a publisher waiting for your next one. So they grab one of the bad ones from the cabinet and try to say, but it's never quite, it was in the cabinet for a reason. So then they're kind of forced to drag out this kind of book that wasn't meant to be seen. And that's why you have, the same way you have second album syndrome, you have like second book syndrome, which Harper Lee and stuff suffered so much from.
Yeah, this is Kevin. While I've intentionally been unsuccessful as a writer.
Yeah, really, very good, Brett. Yeah.
I've actually written 9 books. You're just on your 10th. Yeah, exactly.
That's right.
But yeah, to slightly kind of white pill those who weren't blessed with taste. Taste is getting harder and harder to follow. It is harder to pick up. And East of Eden, it's a bit of a monster.
Yeah.
So a lot of those born with good taste are just gonna scroll that away to some degree. So you can outwork those too. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Right. And there's something to be said about having a taste that runs contrary to the mainline thing, which I would say Hemingway did. Hemingway reinvented the English language, Americanized it, and simplified fiction so that somebody with a 6th grade education could read his story without ever having studied for the GRE or whatever else, without having a thesaurus. And, a more sophisticated reader would maybe get more out of it, maybe not. And that's part of the beauty of his writing. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a quote I remember just from one of the criticisms. It was like, Hemingway would not have written so well if everyone else hadn't written so badly. So it was just like, things had gotten just so, it was like, it was like a copy of a copy of a copy. It just become, it was so artificial. And then he just came out of nowhere and just regrounded things. And I think that's also why he traveled so it was like virality when his first books came out, because they just took over Japan, took over Italy, took over Russia, because it is that simple English that was easily translated without missing that kind of like, whatever, 10-15% that like it dies in translation, that doesn't
Oh,
carry
that's a
over to
great
the
point.
culture. That didn't happen to him. So his was the only thing that could like literally kind of carry that magic through the translation process. And
Very
yeah, you hear in
interesting.
like in 1930s Russia, it was like, who's your favorite writer? And everyone was like, well, besides all the, Russian writers that with a gun to the back of their head, they were like, Hemingway. It was like always their favorite foreign writer.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Yeah, in
I had
fact,
not.
remember, Kevin, do you
Yeah.
remember when we did the Tarkovsky episode? Tarkovsky, as a film student, adapted The Killers by Hemingway. And it was like the first time
One of my
that the
favorites.
Soviet film, quote unquote, industry had allowed an adaptation of an American, of anything that wasn't Soviet, right? Yeah, pretty
Yeah. And we
interesting.
have to think of this period too as sort of America's coming out party as in like a major power, because World War One really flipped things. And America was poised to be a global superpower. And Hemingway kind of provided the muscular prose style to sort of accompany the American century, as corny as that phrase might be.
Yeah.
I mean, America, yeah. America went abroad.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, he was burned in Germany, so that's kind of like, you're doing something right.
Why did they burn him in Germany? For
I
just
think it was just the sheer Americana of it.
sure.
Right. To be honest, I think they're probably burning everything. It was like
Yeah,
1933, so
they were burning a lot. Yeah.
Fair enough. Yeah.
Let me read. We're approaching the end, and we'd like to read at least a little something. As we were coming towards this, I grabbed the nearest Hemingway book that I had, which happened to be this cool old edition of The Snows of Kilimanjaro and Other Stories. And I realized I had never read The Snows of Kilimanjaro, and so I decided to give it a read. And I was kind of surprised. So for people who aren't familiar, it's contextually autobiographical. The character Harry is a writer. He's there with his wife, who does seem to be a fictional version of who is the second wife? Kevin, do you remember her? I can't remember her name off the top of my head.
Oh, it was Hadley, and
then
oh gosh, I'll look it up.
Anyway, the one that had even more money.
Yes.
Yeah.
Pauline.
Yeah. I believe this is supposed to be Pauline. They're in Africa, and the Harry, the character, he took a thorn. He got scratched by a thorn, and it is now gangrenous. And he's waiting to get a plane ride to somewhere where there's a hospital, but of course they're in the Serengeti, and you can't necessarily just snap your fingers and get to the hospital. So the idea is that he's dying, and it alternates between conversations between the writer and his wife, and he says some terrible things to her. I never loved you, and in his head he's convinced himself that he's lied himself into loving her this whole time. And then he alternates that with actually trying to be sweet to her and not wanting to die this way, with this bitterness, but also admitting that he likes quarreling, right? But then as he's sort of fading in and out of consciousness, you have these passages that are curiously very Hemingway-esque, but possibly not. It's almost like a different Hemingway style. It's Hemingway filtered through this idea of a person sort of in a fever dream. And I thought it was interesting that he decided to go this route. So let me just bear with me while I just read a little bit. Again, this is from The Snows of Kilimanjaro. Quote, "No, he had never written about Paris, not the Paris that he cared about. But what about the rest that he had never written? What about the ranch and the silvered gray of the sagebrush, the quick, clear water in the irrigation ditches, and the heavy green of the alfalfa? The trail went up into the hills, and the cattle in the summer were shy as deer, the bawling and the steady noise and slow-moving mass raining a dust as you brought them down in the fall. And behind the mountains, the clear sharpness of the peak and the evening light, and riding down along the trail in the moonlight bright across the valley. Now he remembered coming down through the timber in the dark, holding the horse's tail when you could not see, and all the stories that he meant to write. About the half-wit chore boy who was left at the ranch that time and told not to let anyone get any hay, and that old bastard from the Forks who had beaten the boy when he had worked for him, stopping to get some feed. The boy refusing, and the old man saying he would beat him again. The boy got the rifle from the kitchen and shot him when he tried to come into the barn, and when they came back to the ranch, he'd been dead a week. frozen in the corral, and the dogs had eaten part of him. But what was left, you packed on a sled, wrapped in a blanket and roped on, and you got the boy to help you haul it. And the two of you took it out over the road on skis and 60 miles down to town to turn the boy over. He having no idea that he would be arrested, thinking he had done his duty and that you were his friend and he would be rewarded. He'd helped to haul the old man in so everybody could know how bad the old man had been and how he'd tried to steal some feed that didn't belong to him. And when the sheriff put the handcuffs on the boy, he couldn't believe it. Then he'd started to cry. That was one story he had saved to write. He knew at least 20 good stories from out there, and he had never written one. Why? So, sort of at random a little bit, but I that was a sort of an italicized fever dream part. He's switching perspectives. He starts saying you. He switches into the second person, sort of. And there's also, it is a little more interior than I think the vast majority of Hemingway's work is, in that there's a interior dialogue with himself. You know, why didn't he write this thing? There's a conversation going on in his head. And I was just struck by that whole story. I mean, it's a beautiful piece. It's, I don't know, 25, 30 pages. And it reminded me that I think I like the Hemingway short stories better than the novels, really. I think they're each one of them, the best of them anyway, are these sort of perfect little capsules. They're self-contained, they're consistent. You can often feel that he's trying to do something specific, like setting out to capture a specific feeling. And really, I mean, almost, I can't think of a bad one that I've ever read. So yeah. Just wanted to share that with people.
Thanks, Brad.
Yeah.
No, but again, because you do get to avoid that whole, conundrum of plot in the short story. And I think that's what, it's kind of strange. You see some writers talking about him and they say, Hemingway was the greatest poet to ever live. And it's like, an interesting choice of words, because in the short story, more than the novel, and it's something he was like autistically attentive to, was the white to black ratio on the page, which again goes back to the painting thing. He was like, it has to look a certain way, like, the white space is doing as much as the black, which is that kind of poetic quality. And you think of hills like white elephants, when it's just dialogue. There's no description. Sometimes difficult to know kind of who's talking except for the rhythm. And then apparently the whole thing, which you can't really decipher from the text itself, was about him. I think it was him wanting her to have an abortion and her not wanting to. So there's this kind of big, huge kind of gravitational weight just off the page that you're not privy to, but you're kind of getting the secondhand smoke from it. So yeah, no, I think for him it's just short stories, and and he does. Like, he's known for what he's known for, but it bleeds out, and there's like moments of experimentation, like that italicized passage there.
Yeah.
I think Adam Gopnik wrote a piece which kind of ties in, foreshadowing into that kind of gender bendy stuff, from his work as well. And he said it was like, it's less that he was a stoic. He wasn't a stoic. He was a wounded Epicurean. So it was like he was like an Epicurean trying to be a stoic, but it bled out. That kind of fight about him trying not to let emotions in, trying not to let high-minded in. It's not that they're not there. It's like you're actually seeing him struggle to keep them out, which is that kind of dance.
Well, and that's what makes it so interesting to read through, really, is to watching that a person struggle with those sorts of things. Kevin, you had something.
Well, just that this sort of making opaque this part of the story, the abortion, the thing that you dare not speak about, which would have caused scandal at the time and which he wanted to write about anyway. It goes all the way back to the ancient Greeks, where you were not allowed to show the violence on stage. It was literally like obscene or whatever it is, obscene. It was like,
would kind of tell you about it. Yeah.
Precisely. So he's doing a similar thing, just sort of modernized, and it does give it more power. It goes all the way through to, like, we think about a movie like Jaws or Alien. the fact that it's not there until the very end or whatever. You sort of have to it's in your head. Yeah.
The reader has to do it. And he was like huge for like almost kind of democratizing the reading process. And like, the reader was like, you were on a level with him. He wasn't giving you anything. You had to do half the work. And he let you do half the work. He wasn't like, like there's like sometimes like if the writers criticize like the kind of visual turn in as the dominant form of media, whereas like you're given the image and you don't need to create it.
Right.
And but like Jaws was perfect. Even like True Detective season 1, my favorite scene is that when they both sit down and watch the tape, you don't see it, but you just see their faces and they're just like they're kind of spazzing out like.
Right.
That just makes it so much powerful because it could be anything instead of it being something.
Yeah, and the mind immediately populates that emptiness with whatever it's going to do. Every person's is going to be a little bit different. Yeah. Very interesting.
Good times. Well, so we're going to come back on the After Dark. This has been a lot of fun. I'm enjoying this, Dylan. We could go for another 5 hours. We could do an entire course on Hemingway.
Incredible. It's so fun.
What a blast! Yeah, and thank you for being for being a listener and for joining us on this one. I was looking at your essays. It's very interesting stuff. Like Brad said earlier, if you want to maybe think about what it actually takes to write like Hemingway, we strongly recommend you get over to Dylan's Substack and check out those essays. We're going to have two things for the After Dark. We're going to talk about The Garden of Eden, Hemingway's posthumous gender-bending novel, and I'm going to read a little bit from it. And I happen to know that Brad, under the persona of Brad, under his Brad persona, actually climbed Mount Kilimanjaro.
I did, and which Hemingway I don't think did actually. I think he was just near it. Yeah.
So I'm gonna we are gonna pick Brad's brain about like what it was actually like to climb Mount Kilimanjaro. Are you down to do that, Dylan?
Sure.
I think that sounds pretty fun, right?
Me, I don't care. Yeah.
No, absolutely not. No.
Cool. Brilliant. Dylan, give your plugs one more time. Where can people find you, and what do you got going on?
So again, Essayful the plug, Delano A4 on Twitter, and then going on. So started working with a company called O'Shaughnessy Ventures. So we're kind of trying to plaster in or kind of replace all the various porous holes in cinema. In particularly, I'm on the book side, so we're editing a couple of books, trying to give people a sideways path off the high road for all the good writers that are kind of getting overlooked by the fuckery of modern publishing.
Very cool.
So again, if anyone's sitting on a book, send it to me on Twitter. Like we're always looking at new stuff, going through things, looking for new writers. So hit me up for sure.
Awesome. Very cool. Very cool. Well, thank you, Dylan. Yes.
Lots of fun. Yeah,
that was incredible.
Really. Yeah, very good. We'll be back on the After Dark for Patreon, patreon.com/artofdarkpod. And I'm going to box my way out of the room quick.
Hemingway.
Yes.